From a struggling Finnish financial services group to a leading Northern European property and casualty insurer, this is the story of the people, decisions and deals that shape the Sampo Group of today. Welcome to episode 3 of Inside Sampo. With Sampo's P&C business, If, firing on all cylinders, the group set out to maximize the value of its banking assets. However, this proved an uphill battle as the tectonic plates of the banking industry shifted after the global financial crisis. In this final part of the series, we will explore how Sampo finally returned to its P&C insurance roots. With me in the studio is Björn Nalle Wahlroos, former Group CEO and Chairman of Sampo, among other things, and Torbjörn Magnusson, former Group CEO of Sampo. And I am Petra von Lohr, moderating this podcast today. So, glad to have you here. I'd like to start asking you about the sale of Sampo Bank to Danske, because this was a really big deal in the Nordics. And it had really perfect timing for Sampo. Can you tell us a little bit how this came about?
You're right in saying it was a big deal. I mean, it was the biggest cash deal ever done by a Finnish company at that time. Not everybody thought it was a big deal. There was a small notice in Dagens Industri where Annika Falkengren, then CEO of SEB, said that the price was too high. Nothing more than that. And no other Swedish paper said a single thing about the deal, which I think is a fascinating sort of flash view on Swedish media. When we, Sampo, about a year later, the same year, a month later, when it became public knowledge that we had bought 1% of Nordea. It was all over the Swedish papers, and Nordea stock went up by 7% and Sampo stock went up by 3%. And this was, the Nordea deal was sort of this big, whereas selling Sampo Bank for 4 billion euros, 40 billion Swedish kronas, was actually a big deal. Okay, so how did it come about? When we had gone all in in general insurance, in P&C insurance in 2004, it became a foregone conclusion that we would not be an investor into banking. We would not add our capital exposure to banking. And of course, since banking was moving ahead, I mean, there were a lot of deals being made. Standing still was not really a good strategic option. So pretty early on after the If deal, we came to the mental conclusion that we would sell the bank if we'd just be able to set up a good deal. So it was sort of, that's how it's, and then I started babbling about this. This is my way always of trying to do a deal by talking to investors at investor meetings and whatever. I say, yeah, we're of course at some point we're going to sell it, but not at this price and da-da-da-da. And of course, these are people, they're social people, they babble a lot. So without having it printed in media, of course, the word spread that ultimately we might sell this thing. And that created some fizz. And I was approached. I was approached by representatives of Swedbank. I was approached by the CEO of Danske. I was approached by SEB. I was approached by Investor, the big shareholder in SEB, in various forms over about 2 years' time. And the most keen was really Danske Bank. The sort of next to crucial approach occurred in Budapest, Hungary, where the then CEO of Danske, Peter Strorup, in a reception line approached me. I said, "How much do you want for your bank?" And it was kind of a busy moment, so I sort of gave him a quick answer, and I said, "I want 5 times book for the Baltic operations and 3 times book for the Finnish operations." That was that. He said, "That's outrageous. And then we were served drinks or something and disappeared into the party. Eventually, sort of fast forwarding, we had a couple of meetings, we had a lunch, and he asked me a lot of questions and whatever. And then ultimately I was sitting having lunch with my wife in Venice, where I had just presented Sampo at a group meeting of American investors who eventually went on to become our biggest international shareholder for the next 10 years. My phone rang and my secretary was on the line and said, Mr. Starov wants to meet with you in London October 5th when, this is 2006, when you're both there for the big Merrill Lynch conference. And I said, okay, it's fine, but not too early. I hate early mornings. And eventually it turned out I had a presentation at 8:45 with Sampo, so I had to accept meeting Peter at 8:15, and I asked my secretary to call back and say I only have sort of 20-25 minutes. And then I got the answer, no, it's not a problem. Mr. Starov just wants to hand Mr. Wahlroos a paper or something, some document. Okay, so this could be interesting. Anyway, eventually Peter messaged me and said, can you make it at 8? And I was there 5 minutes after 8 in his hotel room at the Landmark in London. And Peter was a no-nonsense person, so he just shuffled an envelope over the table. And I had sort of decided I'd told our investors traditionally that I want to get 3 billion for the bank. And then when things went rather well, I had upped that to 3.5 billion and whatever. And then I got the envelope. And of course, it had been preceded by some talks between Peter and myself. I opened it and there was a bid for 4.05 billion. I tried to keep a sort of quiet, sort of stiff face, no tells, nothing. And I said, this is something I'll have to talk with my chairman. And that was it. I went down the elevator. I called Mr. Stadig again, my right-hand man. I said, 4.05, get the group together.
Quickly.
Yeah, the following morning. And, that was how it started. And eventually then there was a lot of technical things to do, which were handled primarily by Mr. Stadig. And eventually, November 7th, only 1 month and 2 days after this, we announced the deal. Actually, we got 25 million more for it. That's why I keep Mr. Stadig. He's very good at those things.
Wonderful. Thank you for sharing. And there were also some interesting anecdotes with you going on bird shoots with the Wallenbergs, for example. Is that something that...
But that was earlier on.
That's early.
The SEB, the Wallenbergs, investor and SEB were very, very interested in buying Sampo Bank. And what, of course, I skipped over here, or what happened after we had gotten the bid from Sampo, it was, of course, a conditional bid and all that. So after we got the paper, we had just 5 weeks of time, and there was a very strongly worded confidentiality clause in that document, and I still felt that I need to protect my board. So that they would, against the shareholder criticism, of which there never was one because the price was so high, that they would be criticized that we had not put up the bank for auction. And in order to protect the board from that kind of criticism, I actually asked in our financial advisor, which in that deal was JP Morgan because Goldman Sachs was conflicted, and asked them who I should ask. I mentioned the names of 6 Scandinavian banks, and we quickly boiled it down to 2, one of which was SEB and the other was Swedbank. And then eventually when I asked the question from the banker from JP Morgan, Robin Lawther, she said, SEB will never pay that price. I kind of knew it because I had walked around Jämtland with Jacob Wallenberg talking about this, and it just fizzled out. Nothing came of it. So eventually we did ask Swedbank, and they got 2 weeks to think about it. I flew down to Spain to meet with their chairman, and 2 weeks later, they came up and said, look, the price is just too high. So I had served that. That was a good thing because the board could now say that they had been looking, they had solicited other bids, and End result, we published the deal. It closed in February 2007. And as you say, I mean, I, of course, had no idea that the biggest financial crisis was just around the corner, but still, it was a very fortuitous moment to sell the bank. And it was a good idea.
Definitely. Extremely good timing. So this sale opened up new opportunities for Sampo. And so how come you decided to reinvest instead of paying dividends or doing share buybacks, for example?
Well, that was an easy one. I mean, the tax consequences of either of them would have been, particularly dividends, the tax consequences would have been very high. And buying back stock was something that, again, half of our shareholders would at that point probably have been opposed to, particularly our 160,000 Finnish small shareholders. So it was, to me, a foregone conclusion that paying it out in a big dividend or something like that would just, the tax bill would have been enormous.
So you decided to invest the proceeds in Nordea. So what was your initial vision for Nordea?
Well, we played around with the idea of sort of creating a diversified holding company and started playing sort of minuscule versions of Warren Buffett and stuff like that, but decided against it. In retrospect, it would not have been a bad idea, but at the moment we decided to stick to our strategy, stick to the fact that we're a financial holding company with roughly half of the capital in banking, half in insurers. Then we looked at the banks that were sort of made some kind of sense, and Nordea at that point, in a sense, was the only bank in Scandinavia that didn't have a sort of key shareholder. They did have the Swedish state owning 20%, but the Swedish state had made it pretty obvious, or the government had made it pretty obvious they would eventually sell out. So we decided to go into Nordea. At first at a reasonable valuation, but we bought up as the stock price came up as we were buying. Fortunately, we stopped buying at around a little after 10%, 11, 12%, we stopped buying because the price was, we just thought this is too expensive. And then came the banking crisis. Then our big fortune was that we waited through the banking crisis, and then in February of 2009, we decided to go all in. And we bought the rest of the ultimately 21% stake we held at rock bottom prices, paying sort of less than €2 a share for the cheapest shares we ever bought. So ultimately we got Nordea at a very decent price, which was slightly below book.
Yeah. So coming back to your vision for Nordea, what was that?
There was a very simple vision. At that time, we thought, most people, again, sort of thought, this is kind of like with P&C insurance 10 years before. There was a very strong feeling in the market that banking consolidation would continue, and you would have these huge European banks that were modeled on sort of some of the big American banks, and that it was a foregone conclusion that Nordea would be bought by Deutsche or SocGen or somebody.
And on the way, of course, it was a very incomplete merger of national bank organizations. There was much more synergies to come.
There was a lot to do inside Nordea, which perhaps in retrospect we should have been even quicker at doing, but ultimately we get around to it. Of course, the reason why we were a bit slow at doing that was the financial crisis, because there you got several years of just sort of crisis handling in there. But still, as Torbjörn says, the main point was that, again, Nordea was it was the second unconsummated merger. Sampo was the first, Nordea was, and it was obvious that you needed to consummate those mergers, i.e. you need to create a joint platform, both in terms of organization and in terms of IT, communication systems. We proceeded to do that. However, the speed of that process was hindered a lot by new banking regulation and everything that followed in the wake of the financial crisis.
Yeah. So what are the main reasons that the banking consolidation never really happened?
The financial crisis. And part of it was perhaps that it was never that great an idea in the first place. I mean, if you look at some of the great banking mergers, they really haven't delivered the way people expected them to. So, but very clearly the financial crisis came in between. Nobody had the money. I mean, bank stocks dropped by 80, 90%. I mean, you can't, valuation uncertainties pertaining to valuations were huge. Nobody knew what, I mean, there were a lot of people who ran around and said the Deutsche Bank is ridiculously undervalued. I was actually seriously of the opinion that we should buy stock in Deutsche Bank. Turns out it dropped further for a very long time before starting to come up again. And it still hasn't really, we would never have made any money on that. So in that kind of environment, I mean, you simply can't do mergers.
No. Nordea ended up disappointing the market, and its dividend cap forced Sampo to cut its own dividend in 2019, effectively breaking the investment story built around steadily growing dividends. So how significant was this moment for Sampo?
It was significant. I don't know if I don't know if it was Nordea's fault, really. I think the whole promise of forever increasing dividends perhaps was not the greatest thing we had come up with. And I have to admit that this was not really my idea. We had a very strong commitment to the idea that the Sampo stock was a bond-like share. And that was a good marketing argument, really, particularly in those days when bond yields were extremely low. We could come up with a low-risk share with a beta which was very, very low and which produced a very sort of good dividend. Then to promise that dividend would be forever increasing was perhaps a bit naive and or promising a bit too much. So at some point we had to break that. That happened in 2019. It didn't have that much to do with Nordea, although yes, Nordea contributed to the thing.
On the other hand, it didn't really change sort of the long-term development of the group, and the strategy changed very much. I mean, it was a blip in the curve, but
you have to remember that we started out in Nordea with the idea that we're going to sell it very soon. I would have wanted to sell it in 2012, but it took 10 more years because of the financial crisis. So it really wasn't it wasn't a dramatic turnaround. And we did some effort. There's a story in the book where we tried to sell it to the Chinese, which was a very fortunate that deal never came about. I mean, again, we would have made money, but this chap who wanted to buy it was apparently so corrupt that we would have had egg all over our face.
Yeah. So the Nordea dividend story was not really the decision that made you decide to focus on P&C insurance?
No, that was part. Torbjörn should take it from here. But of course, from my point of view, again, we went into Nordea in order to sell Nordea at a higher price, which we eventually did. We did a decent return on it, not great, but we made 9% per year for 15 years holding, which again, in banking is one of the best track records over those.
I just count my years.
Yes, you made more during your years. Yes, you did. So this is quite all right.
Yeah.
But the main point was that from the start, it was not supposed, we were not going to be power players in the Swedish mode in Nordea forever and ever. And it was a decent thing. But of course, the big surprise that came in was the financial crisis and everything it brought with us, particularly banking regulation.
So the right time to leave the chairmanship to Torbjörn, how did you decide that? How come it happened when it happened?
Well, it was more than this. You see, Torbjörn also then, as part of the deal, he took over the CEO spot in Sampo. So all these things actually joined together to create a package, because Karistadi, who had worked with me for almost 20 years, was about to retire as CEO of Sampo, and it was a foregone conclusion that our best divisional commander, or the superstar of the group, Torbjörn, would succeed him. And then it was actually Karistadi who came up with the idea that why don't we do this 1 year ahead, sort of, and let's sort of, because then we could change over leadership in If at the same time. Torbjörn would take over chairmanship in Nordea, but he would surrender his CEO job in If and then take over the chairmanship in If. And in that way, preparing himself for what happened 1 year later when he took over the CEO spot in Sampo. So it was, again, another deal made in heaven, if I may put it that way, whereby we could get all this done. And this goes to your point, there was a hidden conclusion, because the moment we appointed Torbjörn to these positions, it was obvious to the market that we were going to expedite the exit from Nordea.
That was a signal. But Torbjörn, could you perhaps tell us a bit about the actions you did becoming Nordea chairman? What did you see and what did you do? What were the most important things?
I mean, Nordea had changed a lot in the face of all new regulations, in the face of the need for IT investments, and all those things were proceeding, but too slowly, in my opinion. So, I called in the board on the night of the AGM when I became chair, and said, okay, we're going to work late night now, and I served, as a symbol, sandwiches and water. I'm not sure you've done that often, Nalle, and said, okay, we need to speed this up. And what do you do then? Well, you look at people, of course. You look at incentives. Nordea needed a safe pair of hands, but maybe also a little bit tougher pair of hands. And then Nordea management team hadn't been really clear about whether they were, I think, in my opinion, a corporate bank, a retail bank, an investment bank. And you have to be clear about where you're going, what the direction is. And we appointed very clearly a retail banker as CEO. And and the board, that was, I think, I enjoyed that very much. I got the board to work together, and they participated in writing quarterly reports for a while. They interviewed people for the top positions, and the board became a team in a nice way, in the face of these challenges.
They were perhaps a little bit more hands-on than a normal board.
As you should be in a board when you want to change things, yes.
When exactly did you decide that Sampo should focus on P&C insurance?
Well, again, it was not really a great strategic evaluation. The logic went the other way around. We decided that Sampo should get out of banking at a very early juncture. In a sense, we actually were going in that direction already when we bought into Nordea, because to our mind it was a deal where we could create value, and then the great merger process would sort of just swallow up Nordea, and we'd be happy we get stock in Deutsche Bank or whatever, then we would sell that to the market. So in a sense, we were headed in that direction anyway, perhaps with the proviso that you may ask me, what would we then have done with the money that we got out of that? And I would have to say we didn't really think it that far. But we were certainly on our way out of Sampo, and it was just a question of when and how. And I think I was looking for a trade sale, i.e. finding a buyer for Nordea, perhaps a little too long, because, as I said, the Chinese thing didn't work that well. Actually, ultimately, we discussed the merger with Deutsche Bank in very serious terms. So there you have it. But ultimately, the focus on P&C came up partly as the default solution because we wanted out of banking. And then secondly, it came up from the fact that we had Europe's by far best management team in insurance. So it's very obvious that you focus on that.
Yeah.
I think another thing, when I took up the CEO position, we started discussing in the board what the strategy should be. The fact that we, in contrast to Nordea, had invested in all these IT things and digitalization for a decade and were leading that, meant that it was possible to take that decision. We believe that we will have a competitive advantage for a long time in P&C, and that wasn't really there in any other line.
Interesting. So in 2020, Sampo acquired a majority stake in Hastings. Why expanding to the UK?
Well, we had been looking at expansion plans for some time, and basically ended up, I think I babbled sometimes about saying there are only two markets that we could think of going into. One was the Netherlands and the other was Britain. And this, of course, was misinterpreted by some investors who were very worried that we were buying a Dutch company and whatever. But the main point was really that we had been looking at this, and then Torbjörn's very skillful M&A team had narrowed down the cases to just a few and eventually to Hastings. I think he should give you a very good idea how that went. I think, say that this deal was very much Torbjörn's deal, and it was different from the deals that we've been discussing so far that were more my deals, because this was one which required a lot of skill in the industry, and it was kind of challenging because you went, and we heard this from many of our investors, we went into perhaps the most competitive market in all of Europe in going into British motor insurance.
Yeah, it was an exciting transaction in that we started looking at opportunities. We've always looked at opportunities. The number of blue binders that you and we have seen over the years is vast. But then there was an opportunity. You can never plan for that, but there was an opportunity with a company that had good people, first of all, that had an excellent track record. I believe more in that in promises than promises for the future. Good technology, thank you. And they were not in the UK market as such. They were in the digital segment of the UK market, so a little bit similar to the Nordic situation. And we were able to in 2 rounds buy the company, and the world was a bit skeptical first. Actually, you were less skeptical than I thought you would have been when we bought this. The reception of the transaction wasn't great. The Sampo share price didn't go up. And then we worked with the management team there, and we now have 1 million more customers, and the size of the company is twice the size when we bought it. And it's been a great journey.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
In 5 years only.
Yes.
I don't think I was, you're right in saying I wasn't that skeptical, but I was skeptical to some extent, and that had a lot to do with the fact that it was different from the transactions we had done in the past. Yeah. And of course, the time I had to sort of really get into it, there was no possibility for me to, I don't understand anything about that digital UK sort of motor market. So it was very much different, and it was very much sort of Torbjörn's deal, and it's been a great success.
Fantastic.
Yeah. And remember, if you stay in the Nordic P&C market only, this is not the biggest part of Sampo, but it's substantial nowadays. But if you stay in the Nordic market only, then the growth prospects are quite limited. And this, in contrast to a number of other Nordic insurers, gave us a growth area which is helpful and which is interesting.
In late 2020, Elliott entered the Sampo stock, agitating for quicker change. What was your reaction to that?
Or can I start?
Yeah.
Because they phoned me up first.
Yeah.
And said, we want to really change things. We want you to consider selling out Nordea. That was about 6 months or 9 months after I had taken up the CEO position. So 2 years after you started thinking about it, there was absolutely no news and didn't change a thing.
No, they kicked him in an open door. I mean, it was almost, I had several conference calls with them during that period, and they were almost pathetic because we were just saying, look, I mean, we're just doing this in a smarter way than you are suggesting, and we're doing exactly the same thing. And look, I own more stock, me personally, than you do. So trust me, I have exactly the same interest. This was the conversation.
You had a lot of skin in the game.
Yeah, certainly enough and more than they did. So it was kind of a ridiculous thing. But as always with these activist funds, it's 80% about media exposure and 20% about content.
It was a good marketing exercise.
Yes. It really was. But perhaps you could also tell us a little bit about the Mandatum spin-off you made in 2023.
That was the last thing that I had anything to do with, but I did have something to do with it because I have a somewhat more we might say Finnish or straightforward approach to board work. Torbjörn is more of an inclusive, involving sort of chairman. I think most board members are most productive if they basically shut up. And no, I'm exaggerating a little, but I there are very few moments when I have seen I've chaired three boards of three very big Scandinavian companies during more than a decade, during a total period of a lot of years, and I don't think I've seen a single decision really made at a board meeting. It's not to say that boards wouldn't make decisions, but I very rarely see a board discussion leading up to a decision. Now, the spin-off of Mandatum was such a decision by chance. And what happened was very simply that we were meeting for the annual evaluation of strategies, and it was not strategy; it was just the investment lines. We were discussing limits for various investments and weights on different investments, and all of a sudden there erupted a small sort of exchange of views between our CFO and our CIO, where our CFO was worried about capital exposure and that we were actually running too much. We had too high an equity weight. He did not have a market view. He looked at capital and the risk weighting of this. And our CIO sort of blew his top and basically said, if we go with what you say, we're never going to invest in anything that is really good and whatever. And then I broke off that as chairman, and I said, there's just one sensible solution to this discussion. We actually need to spin off this thing because most of those equities were in our life insurance operation. And then everybody stopped, and then we all agreed that it's something we need to look at. Now, looking at it, for those of us who are used to the Finnish regulatory system and the Finnish tax code with respect to spin-offs, the technique of how you do it was very obvious, but it took a couple of weeks to teach our Swedish colleagues how you do this thing without tax consequences, or our CFO. And anyway, but otherwise it's a foregone conclusion. In order, again, to protect the board, we first offered Mandatum, which is the life insurance and asset management operation, up for sale. And we received bids, but I had a very strict sort of price limit and nobody came up to that limit. So we just spun it off, which was the very correct decision because the stock has, including dividends, it has doubled after the spin-off.
Good shareholder value.
Yes.
So another deal, what made you interested in Top Denmark and decide to invest there?
That was an even longer story. When I became CEO, there were very few role models at all, not least in the Nordics, because their companies had not focused on profits. And obviously, when everyone started losing money in the late 90s and early 2000s, you needed to change. And they had done that. So they were the one company that could at least show me some of the ways that you could think about this. And then they did really well until the financial crisis, where they had invested in some financial instruments that they shouldn't have. And I went to my then chair, Kari Stading, and said, there's an opportunity to buy into a really good company at a good price here. Bought into the company a bit more, and then things developed from there. And eventually I was on the board, eventually I became chair, and eventually we bought the rest of the company the other year.
So what were the major changes you did as chairman of Top Denmark?
At that stage, I can't actually remember what year it was, 2015, 2016 maybe. The then management team did not believe in webification. And by that stage, we knew we were on the right track in If P&C. We could see where this was going. It's a long process, and they hadn't even started. So I think that's the main thing I did, to decide on that strategy, to change that, and take the consequences of it in terms of management team. We did change a number of people.
So was Top 10 Mac the last team for Sampo?
It's difficult to predict, especially the future, people say. And at the moment, we're in a period where we get fantastic payoff for organic growth. And we do that really well, and we have all the tools, and we're competitive with those tools in the market. Who knows what will happen over the long term? Let's see.
So what is the most important value-creating decision that you have ever made?
Buying If.
With hindsight, yes.
Yeah, but you weren't there when Kari and I were discussing it. You came in sort of 1 week later, or no, a couple of months later, and we were pretty confident. We had looked at Skandia for 2 years, and we pulled it apart in many ways. Not me, but Kari Stadi, Patrick Lappvettelän, and others, and our advisors had pulled it apart. And we had sat for half a year negotiating an acquisition of all of Skandia, and we had come to the conclusion that it was a stupid idea. But at the same time, we had really learned a lot about P&C insurance. So ultimately, we knew quite a lot, and we had a sort of conceptual business plan in mind. It's nothing like what Torbjörn then did with it, but we were not worried about it. We were confident we had something that would return quite a good sort of return on the capital, nowhere near as good as it eventually became.
But I typically tell people that none of Wahlroos is not actually the deal maker that people say, because you haven't made dozens of large transactions with Sampo, but they have been fewer and much better than what people understand, the ones that you have led. And that includes certainly astonishing the sale of Sampo Bank, but it also includes the covered bonds investments after the financial crisis, eventually Top Denmark, where you were a bit skeptical for a while.
And when the price went up, I mean, you remember the stock price?
The PE multiple was prohibitive for a period. Then we did Hastings, which we have doubled the size of the company in 5 years. And finally, Mandatum. There's not a lot to complain about there.
No. It's a good track record.
Yes.
And even Nordea returned a decent return, ultimately. So that is, it is good.
Yes.
And then you could turn it around and say, one of the part of the culture that we developed, I think, was that we actually got up from the table many times. We said no to a great number of transactions. We've discussed 2 of them during these, Storebrand and Skandia, but there were many others. And we did not merge with Deutsche Bank.
And this is also a point, I think, because Sampo, as a consequence of your leadership, but also as a consequence of the people there, is risk about. Has always been risk about. We don't want to buy everything, go Deutsche Bank, buy lots of insurance companies in Southern Europe or Turkey. We haven't done that. We only do transactions when it really, really makes sense and is attractive.
Which is incidentally is interesting because perhaps not Sampo, but I find myself particularly in Finland, but also in Sweden, I find myself viewed as a big risk taker. And everybody who works with me actually complains that I'm so risk averse, which I find a bit amusing.
That's amusing.
There's a story that you've forgotten, but maybe the second year or something, I came to you and said, we've got the world's second biggest marine and energy operation, and I don't think it's going to be very profitable. And it's almost 10% of the company. Would you ever consider selling it? And you said something like, is it not going to be profitable? What are you doing here? Go and sell it. Yeah.
Easy.
And I said no to a Russian acquisition.
Yes. Yes. Thank you for bringing that up.
No. It was not a formal thing, but it would not have been a good choice.
Yeah.
That's true.
Yeah, that's interesting. So we have discussed many deals, but there is one deal that we haven't talked about, and that's the sale of Sampo. Why did you never sell it? EQT, Berkshire, and more were interested?
Well, the EQT deal was a sort of short thing, and it was, I don't know, that was a sort of, it was way too low, and to give you the background, I mean, EQT approached Torbjörn originally, essentially said that we'd very much like to buy the thing, and particularly it was really not Sampo, but at that time it was If they were interested, but at that time If was sort of 90% of Sampo, so it amounted to the same thing. But the price was clearly too low. Torbjörn came up to me and we agreed on how we take that further. And it took the board 10 minutes to agree with me that we'd just basically say, look, you're way too low, and eventually nothing happened. Now the Berkshire Hathaway thing, of course, was much more interesting because we were much closer on that. And it was a weird thing. That was Mr. Stadig's baby, really. We both contributed in our various way. You set up the meeting or the link to Mr. Buffett's right-hand man. And then, of course, I sat there basically making the ultimate call on it. And we were bid in an undocumented way. It was sort of just 10 words. We were bid a decent price for Sampo. It was a 20% premium to what broadly to what the market was at that time. But 20% isn't that much because the way they wanted to do it, there would have been quite a lot of tax consequences for many of our shareholders. So it was very sort of there and there. And then we to make a long story short, this went on for a number of weeks, this conversation. And then eventually I decided that we're not going to accept the offer. We made a counter offer, 8% higher. And they said no. And that was really it. I was surprised. Then I looked into Mr. Buffett's deal making, and turns out he has basically this one deal where he has ever raised his price. So in that sense, I shouldn't have been surprised. But still, the main point was that had the deal been thoroughly documented, had we had a sort of binding offer or something, I may have thought about it differently. Still, in retrospect, it was, again, fortunate that we did not sell because Sampo has delivered a very good return on the share price that we had at the moment, and it would have produced a very good return on the price that Berkshire Hathaway would have paid. So our shareholders should be actually count themselves as lucky.
This was exactly when we knew that the new strategy, the P&C strategy, would be paying off for the coming years. And then 20% is not a lot, and which is what you see now. And
So that decision was correct.
Yes.
That's it for the third episode of our podcast series Inside Sampo. So thank you very much, Nalle Wahlroos and Torbjörn Magnusson, for sharing insights. And of course, thank you to you who tuned in. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to check out other episodes for more great stories.